This is your daily dose of all things royal. Welcome back, my gorgeous, good-looking friends. In parts 1 and 2, we explored the origins of the CCDH, Imran Ahmed's role, and the direct involvement of Harry and Meghan. If you haven't checked out those videos, I highly recommend you do so you're not so lost when I go into this one. I've long maintained that Prince Harry came to America with a specific agenda. And that agenda was to support the Biden campaign and undermine the U.S. Constitution by advocating for widespread censorship, framed as rebuilding the online space, with guardrails to protect people from hate, misinformation, and disinformation that they deem acceptable. I've also maintained the position that the couple have been a part of a covert operation, unleashing this military-grade censorship operation onto unsuspecting innocent people. This amounts to a psychological warfare campaign designed to manufacture a perceived crisis, only to then promote their predetermined solutions in perfect alignment with the broader globalist agenda. As I've always said, that the First Amendment is in the way of these people carrying out what we're seeing happen across all of Europe. In part 3, we're going to talk about who is behind this irritating little man and what is trying to be accomplished. But before I get into it, if you could please help the kid out and hit that like button to jiggle that algorithm, that would be greatly appreciated. As you know, every little bit helps. All right, folks, buckle up for this one.
But the system we have now has actually broken down, only we haven't quite recognized it. And so you need to create a new one. And this is the time to do it.
In the United States, how worried are you about the budget deficit and maybe about the possibility of inflation?
Well, certainly a decline in the value of the dollar is necessary in order to compensate for the fact that the U.S. economy will remain rather weak, will be a drag on the global economy. China will emerge as the motor replacing the U.S. consumer. And, of course, it's a smaller motor because the Chinese economy is much smaller. So the world economy will have less of a motor. So it will move forward slower than it has in the last 25 years. But China will be the engine driving it forward, and the U.S. will be actually a drag that's being pulled along through a gradual decline in the value of the dollar. So there would be a slow decline in the value of the dollar, a managed decline. And that would be the adjustment that it needs to be accomplished.
In order to understand the kind of people behind Imran Ahmed and the CCDH, we have to start with the demon himself, George Soros. George Soros, the evil billionaire whose open society foundations have spent billions reshaping societies, often aligning with powerful political figures to advance his globalist one-world vision, a blueprint that critics decry as elitist engineering, stripping away traditional values in favor of a secular, borderless world order. This approach, void of deference to faith-based principles like Christian humility and communal stewardship, positions him as an extremely disruptive force. For decades, George Soros and other globalist elitists have been using their wealth to influence leaders and policies. Full on display at the World Economic Forum, initiatives reflect a shared elitist ethos where billionaires and politicians convene to dictate global resets. The political theory called authoritarian liberalism refers to a system where liberal economic policies like free markets and globalization are enforced through increasingly undemocratic or coercive state mechanisms, such as surveillance, executive overreach, or insulated institutions, think central banks or supranational bodies like the EU and the United Nations. George Soros, the Hungarian-born billionaire who built his empire on America's free markets, has spent decades biting the hand that fed him. As a naturalized U.S. citizen, he relentlessly slams the country as an arrogant, overreaching superpower, condemning its foreign policies as reckless imperialism and its domestic inequalities as proof of failed leadership. Yet, while he raked in billions from those same markets, he pours those fortunes through his Open Society foundations into a vicious crusade to gut traditional American values. He has bankrolled radical progressive prosecutors and political campaigns that put reform above law and order, deliberately installing district attorneys who unleash soft-on-crime policies that have fueled skyrocketing theft, violence, and chaos in cities across this nation. What we are seeing in Minnesota is not organic. This is all a result of globalists like George Soros, using billions to fund this chaos. What George Soros and all of these elitist parasites are doing is not honest disagreement or philanthropy. It's a calculated, systematic assault on self-reliance, personal responsibility, and the rule of law, all in service of remaking America into a secular, globalist wasteland stripped of its Christian moral foundation. Call it what it is. This is the takedown of Western civilization that has been rooted and based in Christianity. Charity, in all of these people's eyes, is a twisted worldview. It isn't voluntary and personal. It's coerced through bloated state intervention and open border handouts. Soros floods money into the democratic machines and rabid anti-Trump efforts, doing everything in his considerable power to strip freedoms from everyday Americans and concentrate control in the hands of elites who share his contempt for national sovereignty. It's what we are seeing happening in the UK as we speak. For the elites who profited immensely from America's capitalist engine, their actions all reek of ingratitude and betrayal. Now, over the last several days, looking into this ridiculous lawsuit filed by Imran Ahmed of the CCDH, claiming that the United States government violating his First Amendment rights for his censorship advocacy, I've come to the conclusion that all of this censorship is getting people to accept and submit to this forceful migration that is designed to transform and change the fabric of Western society into a society that is socialist, that is dependent on the government, and is controlled. This is what this is all about. And the reason why we're seeing this rise in political Islam is because this is another weapon in George Soros's arsenal to destabilize societies. This is how evil this man is. Through George Soros's Open Society foundations, he's funneled at least $1.8 million to Muslim advocates, a litigious outfit that spearheaded efforts to gut vital counter-terrorism tools like dismantling the NYPD's surveillance of potential radical hotspots, branding it discriminatory, despite the program's aim to protect lives from jihadi threats. And this would explain how the new mayor of New York City, Mamdani, was able to rise so quickly and get into office. This billionaire puppeteer has always treated Democratic power players like Obama and Clinton as his personal investments, dumping millions into their campaigns to buy influence and push his godless, globalist agenda deeper into America's veins. Back in 2008, Soros threw his weight behind the untested Senator Barack Obama, hosting glitzy fundraisers and flooding cash into his campaign that capitulated the community organizers straight to the White House. But by 2012, we started to see the mask slipping. Soros whined to a top Clinton confidant that he made a grave mistake picking Obama over Hillary, bitterly regretting it because Obama's policies hadn't been radical enough for his tastes. This wasn't loyalty, it was cold, opportunistic calculation. Fund the winner, then trash him publicly when he doesn't deliver full-throated destruction of traditional America. Now we fast forward to 2016, and Soros pivoted seamlessly, becoming one of Hillary Clinton's biggest sugar daddies. He shoveled millions into her super PACs like Priorities USA Action and publicly anointed her the high priestess of his precious open societies. His Open Society Foundation bankrolled pet projects perfectly aligned with Clinton-era obsessions, global health schemes, radical women's rights pushes, all while leaked State Department emails from her secretary days exposed cozy overlaps between the Clinton Foundation machine and Soros's vast network. And you might ask, why are all these globalists doing this? Well, it's easy. It's for power and greed. And slowly but surely, what we're seeing with the involvement of these non-governmental organizations, otherwise known as NGOs, is not only transferring and redistributing the wealth of the middle class, but it's also transferring the power away from the people. And what Soros and all of these globalists, including the royal family, have figured out is that charity and nonprofits can be used as a calculated mechanism that siphons wealth and power through these sanctimonious NGO networks, all wrapped in the holy cloak of humanitarianism. Okay, so to expand on this so you can understand how CCDH fits into all of this, it all starts with the state cooking up or eagerly latching onto a juicy moral emergency. Think climate Armageddon, rising right-wing extremism, rising populism, migration crisis, public health pandemics, disinformation epidemics. I mean, pick your poison. There's always a fresh panic on the menu to justify what's coming next. Let me go ahead and give you the perfect example of what I'm talking about here. We're going to go all the way back to March 15th, 2019, the day of the Christchurch Massacre. This is where one person, a lone gunman, carried out consecutive mass shootings at the Al Noor Mosque and the Linwood Islamic Center in Christchurch, New Zealand, during Friday prayers. The attacks killed 51 people and injured dozens more, becoming the deadliest mass shooting in the country's history. Now, this was during a time when we all trusted the mainstream media and weren't really paying attention to who was reporting on this story.
Clearly, what has happened here is an extraordinary and unprecedented act of violence. Many of those who will have been directly affected by this shooting may be migrants to New Zealand. They may even be refugees here.
May be migrants to New Zealand. They may even be refugees here.
They have chosen to make New Zealand their home, and it is their home. They are us. The person who has perpetuated this violence against us is not. They have no place in New Zealand. There is no place in New Zealand for such acts of extreme and unprecedented violence, which it is clear this act was.
Interestingly enough, Jacinda Ardern had all social media platforms pull down any trace of this video with this gunman going into these various mosques and killing people, especially since people were questioning on how did the shooter go from one mosque to the other in the window of time and kill so many people.
It was around 1:45. I was stopped, but I heard the big sound, the gun. And the second one I shot, I ran. Lots of people were sitting in the floor.
If the shooting at the Al Noor Mosque began at 1:45, then how did he make it over to Linwood by 1:52 to commit these heinous acts? Now, during this time, anyone who challenged the narrative or shared this video got penalized, whether it had been suspended or deplatformed or even arrested if you were in New Zealand. It was this incident that was the beginning of seeing this social media censorship. And unbeknownst to the world, Harry and Meghan's participation in advocating for censorship. Now, during this time, Meghan Markle was supposed to be on maternity leave, but on March 19th, Harry and Meghan show up to the New Zealand house unannounced to pay their respects. This visit was not on the schedule, and Meghan Markle was officially on her This visit was not on the schedule, and Meghan was on maternity leave. So why did Harry and Meghan feel the need to go? Well, Buckingham Palace has an excuse for everything. They stated that the reason why Meghan and Harry went was because they were the recent royals that had visited New Zealand. But But I'm not buying it, because here is Megan, who is allegedly supposed to be on maternity leave and over 8 months pregnant, able to drop it low to the ground and get back up without any problems in heels. And then you see Harry, who's not one bit concerned about his heavily pregnant wife toppling over, having difficulty trying to stand, nothing. And out of this so-called Christchurch tragedy came the Christchurch Call, led by Jacinda Ardern and Macron, two young global leaders from the World Economic Forum. So this Christchurch call to action really was the beginning of eliminating content that didn't align with the globalist narrative. But they positioned it that anything that didn't align with being inclusive and diverse and welcoming of these migrants, as well as Islam, was considered right-wing extremism. And that's why they used this so-called incident, which now doesn't really look like an incident anymore, to crack down on speech. Remember, during that time, Donald Trump was in office, and he was trying to deport the many migrants that were coming into the country as a result of Obama's failed policies that George Soros helped fund. This excuse of cutting down on right-wing extremism really was to get a hold of the internet so they could control the information due to the 2020 election coming up. Harry and Meghan were there from the very beginning. This censorship was always about controlling the elections. Now, while the Trump administration declined to join Jacinda Ardern's Christchurch call to action, citing that it was violating First Amendment rights, the Biden administration had no problem selling America out and joining this call to action with Jacinda Ardern, only to discover in 2025, when Tulsi Gabbard released and declassified this document that the Biden administration put together called the Strategic Implementation Plan for Countering Domestic Terrorism, in which they were going to be spying on Americans, looking for those that support Donald Trump, and using whatever means they can to shut those people down, even if it meant lethal force. It says in this document that there was, consideration to be taking away Americans' guns. And this is exactly what Australia has done, New Zealand has done. They were going to try and do that here in the United States. Now entering into the chat, Amy Klobuchar, who is the senator for Minnesota. That state right now that is currently burning as a result of all that Somalian fraud. And you can take a good guess as to how all those Somalian refugees got to Minnesota, which paved the way for this Somalian to then get into Congress, Ilhan Omar. And in 2016, when Donald Trump won the election, the Democrats realized that they didn't have control of the narrative anymore. And people started to realize that this influx of migrants coming into the United States, as well as other places in Western civilization, was starting to put a strain on resources in modern society, particularly in the United States, where many Americans, white Christian Americans, were speaking up about this replacement theory of how the fabric of the United States was being changed so dramatically by importing all of these people from all around the world that did not have America's best interests at heart. Now, people were noticing that the fabric of America was dramatically changing, and not in a good way. And as people had been recognizing it and voicing their concern and pushing back and not wanting to support it, this is why the globalists were so gung-ho on enforcing this censorship, especially as they neared the 2020 election. Once again, Amy Klobuchar, who in July of 2019, she introduced legislation to educate Americans about misinformation online, prevent the impact of foreign influence campaigns. I'm willing to bet that George Soros had some influence on that introduction to this legislation, because then in November of 2019, Issue 1, which is a Soros-backed organization, Amy Klobuchar now all of a sudden is getting honored at the inaugural Teddy Awards for her outstanding commitment to bipartisan political reform and election security. For what it's worth, Imran Ahmed of the CCDH happens to be sitting on the Council for Responsible Social Media. I think you guys knew that already, but I thought I would remind everyone. But anyhow, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're still in 2019. Now enter into 2020. And what happens? CCDH publishes a report on how Google is profiting from misinformation delegitimizing the U.S. elections. Now, keep in mind, in 2020, CCDH had no presence here in the United States. It was not set up as an entity. It was operating solely in the United Kingdom. So what business did CCDH have to put this out there? But what's even more amazing is that in this report of a group that nobody's heard of in the United States, reporting on examples with George Soros and him trying to stage a coup to steal the election, and EIP, which is the Election Integrity Partnership, being a part of that. Just a little fun fact, the Election Integrity Partnership was a part of this censorship complex and was led by Rene DiResta. You know, Rene DiResta, Harry's friend. So this bitch was trying to cover tracks for this whole operation and pointing the finger at the right-wing conservatives for the things that the left had been doing in order to steal this election. And the fact that it was getting called out from the CCDH as misinformation just goes to show how coordinated and connected everybody was during that time. This report, funded by dark money, found its way to Congress in December of 2020 via, you guessed it, Amy Klobuchar, referencing Imran Ahmed's work in urging Google to improve ad policies and combat election-related disinformation. Also on board with this, Prince Harry's African safari buddy, Senator Chris Coons. But Amy Klobuchar doesn't stop there. Literally a few months later, Klobuchar announces the Safe Tech Act to reform Section 230. And who is right by her side in referencing? You guessed it, the CCDH. This time, banging on about the anti-vax COVID misinformation garbage. Now, in a stunning development today, Bad Kitty Unleash had posted about author Jenna Galper being a part of the CCDH. Now, her previous job was the senior communications advisor for the U.S. Congressman Adam B. Schiff, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and also was a part of the J6 committee. Now, brace yourselves in actually looking closer and reading about this global summit to address online harms and misinformation, written by Jenna Galper, who used to work for Adam Schiff. She writes, in the wake of the March 15 terrorist attack at Christchurch Mosque, executives from Meta, Twitter, and Google made a public promise that they would be resolute in their commitment to ensure they are doing all they can to fight hatred and extremism that lead to terrorist violence. But just 3 years after that dark day, social media companies have already failed to keep their promise. New research from the Center for Countering Digital Hate exposes how social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, failed to act on 89% of reported posts containing anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobic content. The content we identified included reference to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory that inspired the Christchurch Mosque terrorists, amongst others. Anti-Muslim hate seeks to dehumanize and marginalize communities of people who have historically been the subject of violent threats, attacks, and discrimination. Enabling this content to be promoted and shared on platforms further endangers these communities by driving social divisions, normalizing abusive behavior, and encouraging offline attacks and violence. Worse still, platforms profit from this hate, monetizing content, interactions, and the resulting attention and engagement. For them, hate is good business. You know who joined this conversation in D.C.? That would be Maria Ressa, Harry and Meghan's buddy that went with them to Colombia. Also in attendance were legislators and regulators from the Five Eyes Nation and the EU. And here is Imran Ahmed at this summit talking about this Great Replacement conspiracy theory that the platforms just won't shut down.
When we conducted a study that came out a few weeks ago, our last platform audit, we found that even when we report posts advocating the Great Replacement theory to platforms using their own platform safety tools, they fail to take action in our study 9 out of 10 times. All they can It's not even the bare minimum. The failure of social media companies to act on known racist content connected with terrorism is a violation of not only their own terms and conditions, but also the pledges made to the international community while the cameras were rolling.
So Imran is referencing this Fugazi and Bias report. And in this report, one of the examples seen here is what they're having issue with on it being racist. And Twitter and Facebook and all these other platforms fail to take action on similar types of content that has been put up. You know, this is the problem with these people. They deem this hateful, even though it is truthful. So now do you understand how Islam is being used with this replacement that we are seeing underway? It's happening. But what we have seen with the CCDH, as well as just these leftists in general, is the weaponization of the media. Soros and other billionaires have funded many organizations to specifically focus on changing the narrative, essentially telling people how to tell the story to force people into accepting this migration. Here is a video that was funded by George Soros.
How have we reached this stage that a single picture or a metaphor triggers for many people a largely negative story about refugees and migration? A story of who is involved, what the problem is, what the solutions are. Viewed through a communication lens, this is about frames and framing. Put simply, frames are stories we use to understand complex and challenging issues in life, like migration or climate change. When a new issue becomes part of the public discussion, we tune in to mainstream and social media, talk it through with friends, and adopt a certain position or frame on the issue. Once we commit to a single frame, we make it our go-to understanding on the issue, and over time, certain frames become highly valued community stories. This makes our attachment to them even stronger, and so they are very easily triggered. Progressives are not doing well in trying to challenge these prominent fear and security frames in the migration debate. When we meet a migration skeptic, we tend to argue facts and rights only, and we often get a dismissive, angry response. Many people say our approach comes across as arrogant and lectury, with audiences left feeling that we think them a bit stupid or even a bit racist. We seem to be stepping on some emotional landmines, and so we really need to understand what's going on if we want to better engage the public. We're living in a time of economic and political discontent with growing divisions in society. Many feel vulnerable and left behind. Populist politicians have exploited and heightened this unease and hijacked people's concerns, putting the blame firmly on one issue: migration. The danger is that any further mainstreaming of such a fear, invasion and threat narrative will limit acceptable policy responses to security, protection and exclusion. In response, it must be our job to separate the worries and concerns of these communities from this toxic blame narrative. So how do we go about doing this? There's a lot of experience in reframing practice to learn from. 1. Who to talk to. First, as advocates, we've tended to focus on attacking or undermining opponents on the strongly anti-immigrant side. But in most countries, there's a big group of people in the middle who are neither strongly pro nor anti, but are concerned and confused about many issues around migration. This group is often called the anxious or movable middle. If we want to change the debate and stop the mainstreaming of populism, we need to focus our efforts on engaging this group. Second, in any heightened conversation, we must deal with emotional tension at the beginning to make a connection. In practice, this means acknowledging the concerns of those we are engaging. Then they will be more open to a real dialogue. Third, we need to know how to open the conversation and build a bridge to more inclusive thinking. We can do this by identifying shared concerns and values between a more inclusive view and that of the movable middle. For example, an NGO partner working at the city level in the USA builds on the following messages. Most every American moves to go to college or work, and aspiring migrants are the same. Working for a living is a basic aspiration for all Americans, including new arrivals. Let migrants do this with the full protection of the Constitution and contribute to the growth of the economy and the country. But not everybody agrees with these ideas, and some advocates and campaigners are sceptical about this reframing approach. First, some think the approach is a weak response and means watering down the message. Instead, we should stick to our position. But we would say this is not about selling out, it's about sequencing. By acknowledging the concerns and fears of a new audience and being emotionally smart, we open the door for constructive dialogue. We can then have a full and frank discussion about the realities of migration. Second, some also think that reframing is just fancy public relations or word games. But as our example illustrates, reframing is not just wrapping our position in nice shiny paper. It's a chance to restructure the debate around common values and put new, positive frames on the table. And lastly, we always come back to the old favourite. If only people knew the facts, everything would be different. Unfortunately, a facts-only approach seems to be closing doors rather than opening dialogue. So it's time to try something different and not always be on the defensive. So let's restructure the debate. Lead the narrative, set the tone, break out of our own bubble and expand the circle by adding new lenses and new voices. And so shift the balance to make inclusion an aspiration, finding connections rather than magnifying differences. Practice shows that reframing works, and there is support from your peers. So let's experiment and learn together. And we'll help you connect and give you support and advice. How about starting with our toolkit?
These globalists know that this migration is tearing society down. And that's what they want. It's all by design. And this useful idiot, Imran, he's going to be one of the first to go when they're finished with him. And a couple of videos back, when I talked about Venezuela, I mentioned these Smartmatic machines in which the UK Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who was connected to that, and George Soros. Take a listen to how this all fits together.
Foreign governments seem to be tied in with these systems, whether it be Canada, Venezuela, Spain, or even Germany. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there's been some reporting that some of these systems in Germany were actually seized. They clearly, Smartmatic has had incredible ties with some of the greater far left concerns that we have, including this Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who's very tight with Soros, is on the Open Society's global board and a bunch of other Soros boards, meaning this is not some casual associate of George Soros. This is kind of an individual who's part of that inner circle. And we have case after case. Philippines is another great example where these systems have been utilized and there's been nothing but broad.
Oh yeah, and who is in the Philippines again? The Markle operatives. So now when we look at elections, not just the United States, but elections around the world, George Soros and Open Society foundations are like right in the heart of it. Lara Logan writes, take a close look at who has been stealing elections all over the world and how they use your tax dollars to pay for it through USAID funding SEPs. Note, it all goes back to Smartmatic and guess who? The Open Society Foundation's George Soros. Come on, DOJ. And look who came to save the day to help the State Department move all those Somalis to the United States and settle them in Minnesota. So now do you understand why Tim Walz was chosen to be Kamala's VP? He's the governor of Minnesota right now in a world of shit. And then you have now shit unraveling for Amy Klobuchar, where a massive FEC complaint has been filed accusing Klobuchar of taking $9.6 million in suspicious campaign donations. Now I think people can understand why Amy is so gung-ho on censorship. And now leading up the COSA bill and trying to get that passed.
The last 2 years you've been blamed for financial collapse of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia.
All of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Are you that powerful?
No, I think there's a great misunderstanding.
The Prime Minister of Malaysia said that the region spent 40 years trying to build up its economy, and along comes a moron like Soros with a lot of money, and it's all over. He called you a criminal.
It's easier for him to blame an outside force. I think that I've been blamed for everything. I am basically there to make money. I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of what I do.
Do you believe in God?
No.
You heard it from the horse's mouth. This is about money. George Soros doesn't care about the chaos, the division, as well as the people suffering. This is about money. Being able to use the politicians to shake the budgets for it to be dispersed, and then to be able to also control the elections to make sure that the people that they have aligned with, like a Amy Klobuchar or Tim Walz, will stay in power. And it's not just George Soros. Let's not forget the other billionaires like Bill Gates and Hans-Jörg Weiss. I mean, we also have King Charles, Prince Andrew, pretty much anyone who is a part of that World Economic Forum cult. Tony Blair, Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, Gordon Brown. You know, I hate to say this, but Canada, Australia, the UK, and the EU all have rolled over and allowed this migration, replacement, whatever it is you want to call it, happen because they're all in on this plan and they're making a killing off of it. When societies eventually collapse, because that's where it's going, where do you think they're all going to be? They're all going to be off in their gated communities away from all the chaos, enjoying their life that they stole from everybody else. America is fighting like hell right now to stop these people. You see the chaos that's happening in Minnesota right now. We're having the same chaos in all of these blue states, and these damn Democrats know that they have to go along with it because this is the monster that they created. And then you have this puppet from the Open Society Foundations trying to convince this audience on Americans thinking differently about migration and accepting savages coming into the country. He is saying to look to Canada as the successful model. Just listen to this craziness that this guy is spewing off.
Conspiracy of silence amongst those who benefited from having essentially an asylum system that was broken, right? So employers got a lot of workers who were without much leverage in terms of their rights, and progressives had the opportunity to see lots of people who they understandably felt should have a right to live in this country come across the border and disappear not completely, but because the court systems didn't work, they were able to stay and establish themselves here. And that all led to, a lot of chaos in communities and a sense of fear that conservatives have exploited. And when there is chaos, you create the conditions for a strong man to come. And that is exactly what Trump has done twice. So let me stop there with the analysis. There's lots I could say about the adverse role of government in all this, the adverse role of foundations. I think foundations have played a really negative role in a lot of this. Litigation, I think that we've relied way too much on litigation to try to establish the rights of immigrants, when in fact this is a project of political persuasion but we've just quietly gone into courts to try to expand rights without actually winning in the court of public opinion, which I think is eminently possible. So let me just switch now to what we are doing and what we have been doing, and talk about an idea that has seized my imagination for the better part of 20 years, and that I've had the privilege of working on within the context of philanthropy for more than a decade, which is the notion of sponsorship. The Canadian government in the late 70s created a program around private sponsorship that allowed individuals in Canadian communities to sponsor refugees. And it became the backbone of the Canadian system. In the United States, at the same time, in 1980, we passed our core refugee-related legislation and created a top-down, government-run system of refugee resettlement that has dominated the US space in the 45 years since. And it is a fundamentally different approach to immigration, right? So one says that communities can decide who comes in, and the other one says that the UNHCR and the State Department can tell communities who should come in to their cities and towns. And over the past 4 years during the Biden administration, we had the chance to see sponsorship in the United States bloom. And it took initially the form of Americans being allowed to sponsor Afghans who came in the summer of 2021. There was a small new program called Sponsor Circles that was created because there were so many Afghans on the bases. And then a few months later, that idea of allowing American citizens to take somebody and bring them into their community was expanded to Ukrainians in a program called the Uniting for Ukraine. And when that program started in April of 2022, no one knew how many Americans would raise their hands. And incredibly, there's been 250,000 Ukrainians sponsored in the United States by Americans. And I won't get into the details of this, but it's worth noting, it was worth noting for me that there was a lot of criticism of that program as being racist, that it was criticized because people felt that it was only made applicable to white Christian, largely women and children from Ukraine, and the United States would never do something like that for other populations. And if they did, they wouldn't get sponsored. And so 6 months later, the Biden administration started a similar program for Venezuelans, expanded it in January of 2023 to Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans. And in 2 years, something on the order of 3 million migrants from those countries were sponsored by Americans. About 500,000 were able to come in from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. I tell you that story because I should just add the other piece of that is that there was an official U.S. refugee program part of this effort. It was called the Welcome Corps, and that was for not just migrants who were named from specific countries, like from the other 5 countries that I mentioned, but then Americans through the U.S. refugee admissions program were able to sponsor formal refugees, and that program launched more or less in the last year of the Biden administration, and there were 35,000 sponsorship groups that were created around the country. The minimum was 5 people had to be in each of these sponsorship groups formally. The average was 15. Amongst them, they raised something on the order of $500 million to sponsor refugees. And that program, all of this has been shut down. So I give that as an example of what went wrong, right? So you had a system in the United States that in its best years, when it was government run completely, was able to bring in its best years, 80,000 refugees. And it was done in a painstaking, top-down way that was alienating to communities. And then when you created a system that was bottom-up, that allowed Americans to step forward and do the work of resettlement, you had a large multiple saying they wanted to do that. So what went wrong? Really, really worth thinking about, because it was a captured institution. The idea of refugee resettlement, the most progressive possible idea, was frankly captured by a refugee establishment that resisted in every possible way the idea that the American people should be resettling refugees. Our work right now, in addition to trying to defend against the attacks of the administration, along with this heroic group of NGOs that are underfunded, under attack by the administration, we're trying to help support them, but we're also litigating a series of cases that also include the refugee program and the sponsorship programs that I just mentioned. We are working really closely with cities and states to try to help shore them up as they are on the front lines of defending against the administration's actions. And we are, most importantly, in my own sort of view, focused on what happens going forward now. How do we build a system which, just with, as with sponsorship, how do we build an entire immigration system which is bottom up, which is community driven? I often use the term demand driven. Immigration needs to be grounded in communities. Employers need to be able to bring in migrants, humanitarian groups, faith groups, others need to bring in refugees. It has to be a system which is responsive to the needs of cities and states and towns around the country.
So over the last 24 hours, Bad Kitty has been coming to some revelations, and one line that caught my attention was her saying, "The Trump who ran the 2020 elections and handled J6 essentially." Bingo! CCDH was not only interfering in 2024, I've been saying this whole entire time that CCDH was in there for the 2020 elections, which means the Labour Party knew, as well as, no doubt, Prince Charles, at the time now King Charles. Why do you think Charles doesn't say anything or stands up for the British people when his country is being invaded and conquered? Or even better, there's no official document from the government indicating that Prince Harry is a private citizen. This would be something that I would think Parliament would have to note down somewhere, especially when it comes to diplomatic relations of Harry living in another country. But did that ever happen? No. All we got was an announcement from Buckingham Palace and the media reporting the narrative that the royal family told them to report. But there's no official documentation, and we still treat this guy as if he's some protected class here in the United States. All of these people have been lying to us this whole entire time. And, you know, for Harry to just go ahead and say, "Oh, I knew about J6 the day before it happened, and I emailed Jack Dorsey, and he didn't get a response." How did you know, Harry?
Jack and I were emailing each other prior to January the 6th, where I warned him that his platform was allowing a coup to be staged. That email was sent the day before, and then it happened, and I haven't heard from him since.
And Harry just so happened to casually say that when he was on this interview call with Renee DiResta. So now going back to Kitty's post here, this would explain why. Same people who were part of the election interference, the same people who were rallied around this whole J6 setup where there were feds involved. And by the way, Harry, whatever happened to all those signal messages, you know, the same app that the FBI used to communicate during that time? Yours just mysteriously disappeared? Can you all understand why Prince Harry's trying to get back to the UK so badly? There's still so much to talk about on this. I really thought that I was going to finish the third part to this, but there's so much more. The people that are behind funding and supporting the CCDH, obviously, one of them is George Soros. Quite a bit of money has been pumped into this organization, but also other wealthy philanthropists who are also a part of this one world vision of tearing society down and supporting this migration, immigration, refugee nonsense. Turns out that 2024 was the best year for the CCDH, bringing in a total of $4,199,947. Looking at the earning for the past 4 years, you can see that 2024 was very important in whatever it is that they were doing. I think there were more Fugazi reports being put out that were biased and skewed about AI and misinformation in the election, as well as hustling to meet with DC in trying to secure positions, whether it be to push legislation forward. And let's not forget that Elon Musk was suing him, so I'm pretty sure there were some donors who had contributed to his legal fund, but probably didn't need to use it because the court ruled in Imran's favor. But he has another lawsuit that he has to deal with that I will talk about in a different video. For now, I think this is where I will stop, even though there's so much more to talk about. I'll let you digest this, and we'll come back to this at another time. I'm going to watch this and see how this develops and see, hopefully, that the United States throws his case out and kicks him to the curb, because Imran Ahmed has to go. And something needs to be done seriously about George Soros and his son, Alex Soros. We need to cut this cancer out of this country. And people really need to start going to jail. It's time. Anyhow, what do you guys think about all of this? As always, I will be back with more content. But until then, please be safe, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Such a fraud.